So, as I say, my name's Amanda. I'm the CEO of the Tablet, and I'm absolutely delighted today to have such a stellar cast with us to discuss Newman. As you know, only days ago, really, Pope Leo announced that John Henry Newman will be declared a Doctor of the Church, which is a rare honour, recognising his profound theological, pastoral, and spiritual impact. And I've had a few people say to me, well, what does that actually mean? What is a doctor of the church? So I will learn something, and I'm sure you will learn something from our speakers today. We'll find out what the title means, why now, and we will be led through this by Professor Renée Köhler-Ryan. This webinar is sponsored by the Notre Dame University in Australia. Very much grateful to them for doing that. We will be running a chat box, so if you just want to put your questions in the chat box as we go through, we'll pick them up and include them in the conversation. Renée, really good to see you. Thank you for doing this. If you'd like to start the webinar.
Thank you, Amanda, and wonderful to be here. I am thrilled to have such a lineup to talk about something that is so dear to all of our hearts, I think. So, without further ado, I'm just going to say that St. John Cardinal Henry Newman is going to be made a Doctor of the Church soon. We don't quite know the day yet. In this webinar, we're exploring Newman, particularly to have a deeper understanding of what makes him a doctor. That is, what great insight has he given the intellectual and faith life of the church? Each of the participants this evening has a relationship with Newman at an intellectual level that I think might even exceed that intellectual engagement and would have a view on why it is that he's going to be declared a doctor. So I'm very excited because, like Amanda, I'm going to learn a lot this evening. Sorry, it's this evening here. It's morning elsewhere, I understand. And together, I think we'll find a fuller picture of the man and of his work. I'm going to really briefly introduce our panelists for this webinar. So I'll start with Dr. Rebekah Varela, who is a lecturer in theology and the arts at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. She specialises in religion and literature in late modernity, with an emphasis on John Henry Newman and the Catholic literary revival. Dr. Shaun Blanchard is my colleague at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, based on the Fremantle campus. He's a North Carolina native and graduate of UNC Oxford, Blackfriars Hall, and Marquette. Shaun writes on Catholicism and the Enlightenment, and his research projects include a study of English-speaking Catholics in the Age of Enlightenment and Revolution and the Modernist Crisis. And Shaun has a story to tell about his own engagement with Newman's works also. Mgr Roderick Strange has worked as a Catholic chaplain at Oxford University, as rector of the Pontifical Beda College in Rome, as a professor of theology at St Mary's University in Twickenham, and as the rector of Mater Ecclesiae College, a pontifical institute based at St Mary's. He's acted as an advisor to the BBC, notably during the papal visit in 2010, when Pope Benedict XVI beatified Cardinal John Henry Newman, and then in 2013 when Pope Francis was elected. He's also written a number of books, including one on John Henry Newman, A Portrait in Letters, and Newman, The Heart of Holiness, which coincided with Newman's canonization, and I know that his work on Newman is ongoing. Dr. Robert Andrews is based here in Sydney and is a member of the Catholic Institute of Sydney, which is a pontifical faculty. He has a PhD in church history at Murdoch University. He maintains a keen interest in various areas of historical scholarship related to the discipline of church history, notably the religious aspects of 19th century Britain, particularly the life, thought, and context of John Henry Newman and the Oxford movement. So without further ado, I'm actually going to go to our first question of this evening, and thank you again, everyone, for joining. I'm going to start with you, Shaun, if I may. Can you explain perhaps to us what it means to be a doctor of the church and the main reasons for Newman being chosen to be a doctor of the church, and why and how should it matter to us that this is happening?
Yeah, thanks, Renee. And lovely to be with you all this morning in the U.S. So a doctor of the church is kind of a special designation. It's not making someone a kind of a new pope or a new apostle, but it is making them a kind of important reference for Catholic teaching. And the real criteria, the idea is that they would be someone of heroic sanctity, so they would already be canonized as a saint, but that they would have eminent doctrine, so that their teaching, and it's usually in a wide variety of areas, their teaching would be seen as an important point of reference for their own context, but also for Catholics throughout history, and increasingly we would be looking to kind of their global impact. So the idea came up in, if you enter a beautiful cathedral or basilica, you'll often see the four Western doctors depicted. So in the late Middle Ages, the Pope declared Ambrose, Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great the four Western doctors. You'll often see that, Jerome wearing his anachronistic cardinal's hat and things like that. And then in the Counter Reformation, one of the popes named four Eastern doctors of the church. So this slowly but surely throughout the last 700 years, more and more doctors have been added. Now there are four women doctors now: Teresa of Avila, Teresa of Lisieux, and some other figures. And then so most recently, for a variety of reasons and a variety of petitioners, a really diverse group of people, formally led by the bishops of England and Wales, there was a request made to the Pope, and it goes through the dicastery for the causes of saints, so the same Vatican office that handles the causes for saints. And we had great confidence that Pope Francis would approve this. I think he gave great indications that he was enthusiastic about Newman and Newman's impact around the Catholic world and the importance of his thought. But Pope Francis passed away, of course, recently, and thankfully Pope Leo was of the same mind and approved the dicastery approved the petition and forwarded the request to the Pope. And he's indicated that he will proclaim Newman a doctor of the church. So it's very, very exciting, and it really kind of raises Newman's teaching as a kind of official point of reference, I would say, for the global church moving forward.
Thank you, Shaun. And I think it helps us to shine a spotlight on Newman, who was relatively recently declared a saint. So to go even deeper into an understanding of the man and his work and his influence, I think is quite exciting as well. I wonder if I might turn to Rod and to Robert as well, and to ask you this. So you've both approached Newman's work through looking at his life in various different ways. I'm wondering if you could give some insight into Newman, the man, within the context of his own age. So, what during Newman's own time do you think was his contribution? And then, how do you think that his life and thought might inform present Catholic debates? Rod, could I ask you first?
Yes, thanks, Renée, and thanks to you all for being here and for us all to have this conversation. I think the specific thing I would add, what makes Newman distinctive, at least to my mind, is that is the method of his thinking, the way that he thought. And I think this is what makes him, other doctors of the church we might think of because of particular contributions they have made. I mean, one can think, I suppose, most obviously of Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologiae. But with Newman, it was really an awareness of how complex it is understanding mysteries. And I think if we can, through Newman, not be sort of clutching at smart, neat answers, but become patient with sometimes the complexity of things and the limitations of language. I mean, Newman, for example, was very interested in the limitations of language, and was keen to not to resolve mysteries, but to illustrate mysteries by using different words, sometimes words, titles that might seem contrary, to be clashing with each other. But in fact, by using these different concepts to think of the second person of the Trinity both as the Word, interior to God, but also the Son, who became man, the Word made flesh. That sense of both the internal and the external dimensions. Some people might look at that and say, well, if he's the Word, he can't be the Son. If he's the Son, he can't be the Word. But Newman wasn't trying to pretend that those titles, those images for the Christ sort of somehow exhausted the mystery, not at all, but felt that they gave us, they could make us patient with opening up sort of a deeper understanding of the mystery. I hope that's not too complicated a thing to say.
I hope not, too. Thank you, Rod. I think so the complexity is something that we can delve into a little bit more. Robert, I know from knowing of your work for some time as well, that some of that appreciation of complexity may well come from the complex issues that Newman was dealing with and also the complex social situation that he was in. I wonder if you might comment further.
Absolutely. So thanks for having me. I agree with Monsignor Rod. Newman is, I believe, different is the word used. I would say Newman, if I were to reading Twitter or X as it is recently, there's been questions of what is Newman a doctor of? Now, I'm thinking of Newman as a doctor of modernity. Now, I use that term cautiously, but Newman lives in an age in Britain where I think we're bridging the periods of early modernity and modernity. If we take the period, if we think of 1829 Catholic emancipation, this is a key date for Newman. Newman, for example, protests against his own member of Parliament, Robert Peel, at Oxford University. He is opposed to Catholic emancipation in his Anglican years. The reason he's opposed to Catholic emancipation is he believes in Catholicity. Now, at that stage of his life, that means the Catholicity of the Church of England. That will go through some changes in Newman's mind. One of the challenges of Catholic emancipation is the reality that the British state is religiously pluralistic. And of course, we all live in states that are pluralistic religiously. Newman, I think, bridges, I think, the gap between early modernity and modernity in the sense that he clearly believes in religious freedom. As a Catholic, even though he opposes it and as an Anglican, as a Catholic, he accepts it. We are all heirs to that, I think. We're all heirs to what Newman stood for in that period. Certainly, perhaps if we're Catholics, if we are Catholic, we stand with perhaps some of Newman's later reflections. His stand against liberalism, I think, is particularly important. What he means by that, of course, is an interesting question. It clearly doesn't mean the same thing it meant when he opposes Catholic emancipation in 1829, in which he is opposed to that kind of liberalism. He's not opposed to that kind of liberalism. By the end of his life, he's opposed perhaps to relativism. So I think I would see Newman primarily as bridging those gaps. The end of the Reformation is Newman's life, really. 1829, Catholic emancipation. Newman begins that battle of ideas, the free marketplace of religious ideas. Newman is comfortable in, even though the irony is early on, he opposes that. So, yeah, I'd see Newman as bridging a number of, as a bridge in a sense, bridging a number of gaps.
What I'm hearing from both of you is that there's a certain comfort, might not be the right word, but he's willing to accept complexity, perhaps in a way that increasingly right now we're not necessarily able to. Even if you look at the way that he writes, it's not exactly a Twitter grab or an X grab. You know, you have to kind of submit to the argument and to the flow of the language and to follow through until the end. of what he's writing, and there's something, the patience that requires of the reader is probably something that we could learn from quite a bit now. Do you think that that's fair? Rod, just
If I
going back
may,
to what you were saying
Rod,
as
yeah,
well, in the complexity of speaking about Christ in different ways, and
Yeah,
dwelling on that almost paradoxical.
yes. If I could, a different kind of example would be, people sometimes wonder, talk about Newman's being against the liberals and being very traditionalist. And of course, in one sense, he was very much a sort of a Tory and all the rest of it. But I mean, one of the things about Newman is, he spoke of himself as an occasional writer, which didn't mean he wrote occasionally, because he was actually writing all the time, huge amounts of work. But as but the occasion means that he was responding to the situation, responding to the context. And in the context of his Anglican years, he felt that the Church of England had lost a sense of the importance of dogma, so that he was emphatic about the importance of dogma. And he spoke about dogma as being the great principle of his life from the age of 15. But when he became a Catholic, of course, dogma was not at risk. On the contrary, Catholics in the later part of the 19th century were much too dogmatist. They were emphasizing dogma, and so that's the point at which he saw the need in that context to open up sort of the complexities and the breadth of theology, to be a champion of theology, not because he had suddenly turned against dogma, but trying to hold these two things together, to be clear about the teaching of the Church's dogmas, but actually also to show that these teachings were complex and they could be interpreted in different ways. And the fact that people might have varying interpretations didn't mean that they were necessarily opposed to each other, because of the complexity of what was being addressed.
And it sounds like what we may be talking about is that Catholic sense of mystery, something that one can never get to the depths or the bottom of, that you can always find something new to know. Yeah. Thank you, Rod. Rebekah, can I turn to you and ask you this? So every saint, I think, gives us some insight into what it means to be fully alive, really to be basking in the glory of God. And I wanted to ask you if you might comment on Newman's lines, which I certainly find very interesting and helpful in working with young people in particular. But God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work with me, which he has not committed to another. So do you think that this attitude, or this the way that he's speaking here, might have something to do with his understanding of his priestly and pastoral vocation? And what might that help us to understand about Newman the man?
That's a great question, and thank you for having me, Renee. It's lovely to be with all of you. It's an honor, really, and what an occasion to celebrate. I'm just so delighted that Newman will be soon a doctor of the church. What I'd like to do, actually, if I may, is first quote a little bit more from that particular prayer, because the context of that quotation is quite important, and especially in the late 19th century and into the 20th, Newman's power of writing really captivated a lot of other writers and thinkers, many of whom were not Catholic or who stood in a complicated relationship to Catholicism. For example, James Joyce, praised Newman as, unrivaled in terms of even the way he wrote and the way he presented ideas. His ability to draw out the concrete, the definite, and the personal implications of sometimes very complicated concepts, like the ones that have just been discussed. So I would just, in order to give, I hope, a more fulsome response, I'd love to turn to Newman himself and quote from him just a little bit more with respect to his meditation on God calling all of us to a definite service. So this prayer comes from a posthumously collected work of Newman's. So this was put together after he died, called Meditations and Devotions, but it comes from some of his own personal prayer journals and some of his more personal writings, which sometimes then emerged in some of his sermons and other parts of his writings, such as Grammar of Assent. But this specific quotation comes from March 7th, 1848, which is the year that he founds the first English-speaking oratory in Birmingham. And this is just a few years after he's converted to Roman Catholicism. And it was a very turbulent time for him in many ways. He often talked about how after his conversion, he felt a peace and a joy spiritually and in his conscience, but he also felt quite a profound social desolation because, as was mentioned a bit earlier on, of course, there were still penal laws in effect against Catholics. A right to study in Oxford was not granted to non-Anglicans until into the 1870s, early 1880s. So this was a time of quite social desolation for Newman shortly after his conversion. And he had quite a bit of existential uncertainty. And I think that's one of the ways in which he does really resonate as a doctor of late modernity or modernity, because he's really endured and carried the burdens of his times personally and had to wrestle with them, questions of discernment, truth seeking, and so forth. And sometimes he found it very difficult to find his next step or, what was going to be the overall pattern of his life now that he had stepped away from all of the kind of known social structures that he was accustomed to in his Anglican years. And in some ways, this quotation that you read for us, Renee, is, I think, a kind of companion piece to his earlier poem that many of us know, Lead Kindly Light. And so anyway, I just wanted to read a little bit from this passage of prayerful reflection. God was all complete, all blessed in himself, but it was his will to create a world for his glory. We are all created in his glory. We are created to do his will. I am created to do something or to be something for which no one else is created. God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I never may know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. Somehow I am necessary for his purposes, as necessary in my place as an archangel in his. Yet I have a part in this great work. I am a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. I shall do good. I shall do his work. I shall be an angel of peace, a preacher of truth in my own place, while not intending it, if I do but keep his commandments and serve him in my calling. I think we could have a whole Zoom session just on that passage. There's a lot to unpack there in terms of this whole vision of life. And a couple things I'd like to draw out just to talk about Newman the man, also Newman the saint. First of all, what a radical act of hope. And in fact, that passage, that prayerful passage, is linked under a subtitle called Hope in God Creator. And clearly, this prayer is an act of hope, an act of entrustment to God's provident care for Newman's own life, but then by extension for all of our own lives. And something that he really emphasizes here is that life is a mystery. There is often complexity and uncertainty, like the kind that Rod was talking about. And Newman saw that turning to the sacraments of the church's teachings, the example of the saints, they could all be kind of mainstays and exemplars and guides, kind of beacons of hope to help us conform to God's will, even if we're not always quite sure what the overall picture of our life is going to look like. So that is important. Seeing the church as a guide, as a help, as a mother, and her teachings as not just these, like hammer slams on us to make sure we behave, but actually rather these remarkable freeing sites of guidance and support. So I would say, when we think about him becoming a doctor of the church, I think he has a lot to offer us in terms of deepening our understanding of doctrine as a way to guide and to help us. So I'd say that. But another thing that really strikes me in this passage is that he's very keen that our life of prayer and of piety, our philosophical reflections, should translate into charitable acts of service. And he talks quite a bit about this in his writings, especially in Grammar of Assent. There's a often quoted phrase, especially in scholarship, about where Newman says the notional must become real. I'm paraphrasing there, but our ideas, our assent to the truth, must also then translate into action, into a life of definite service. And of course, to become a saint, in addition to various requirements, including miracles that are granted through the saint's intercession, a life of virtue is also so key to defining someone as a saint. And Newman was a person who lived a very deeply virtuous life, was incredibly generous, especially even at times when he was suffering uncertainty, misunderstanding, social alienation. He didn't, and perhaps this could even be a tendency of his, is maybe to want to just, as a bit melancholic, turn inward. But he chose to, stay outward, as it were, to care for others. And I think also sometimes in Newman scholarship or discussions of Newman, we get the sense of this big mind hovering over the waters or something, but he was deeply personal. And he spent a lot of time caring for school children that he helped with and supported and even taught in his Anglican years in the Littlemore district, just outside of the Oxford city centre. And then also when he founded the Birmingham Oratory School in Edgbaston about 10 years after he founded the first English-speaking oratory. And of course, even his own motto when he is elevated and made a cardinal by Pope Leo XIII in 1879, he takes his motto from St. Francis de Sales, Cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart, which again, if we're familiar with Newman even just a little bit, we probably know that phrase, but he really lived that phrase out before he then chose it in later life when he became cardinal. And that not only speaks to his life of service, but also to his understanding that primarily our life is about being in conversation, in colloquy with God, in our life of prayer, even in the way that we're pursuing the truth. He understood even the philosophic enterprise, searching for the truth, as actually being a conversation with God, because it very often the search for truth is, propelled by our conscience, by our desire to know, to find what is good and worthwhile. And he, of course, defines the conscience as the Aboriginal Vicar of Christ, God speaking in our hearts. So for those reasons, I think turning to this prayer, the one that you picked out, Renée, is a great, I think, encapsulation of his vision of how we live out the Christian calling concretely.
Thank you, Rebekah. I think that you've shown so richly how the personal and ideas are actually really alive in Newman, and I think that is something very compelling. Shaun, I know you sort of you had an interesting turn of phrase when I asked you the first question, which was, when we put it to the dicastery. So just for those who may or may not have picked up on that, I think that Shaun, you'll have some great insight into the many reasons why Newman is being declared a doctor. I didn't want to let that pass just as a passing thing. So thank you, because we're here in a way because of you and the other scholars who put this forward. Any doctor of the church has something to teach us. And I want to turn to a number of different doctrines and ideas even more explicitly in Newman now for everyone. But I wanted to start with you. I know that you've worked a lot with ideas of the Second Vatican Council, and certainly I find in magisterial documents, now that I'm more aware of Newman, I find him popping up everywhere in 20th century magisterial teaching in really interesting ways. In the latest AI guiding note, there's Newman. It's really, really interesting. So I just wanted to ask you, first of all, about his idea of the development of doctrine. Some might hear this and think that Newman is arguing that the church should change the way that she thinks and the way that she teaches, even what she thinks and what she teaches. What does he actually mean when he says that doctrine develops?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Renee. Well, let me just say I was definitely a junior partner in this effort to have Newman declared a doctor of the church. It is something I can talk about later if folks are interested in hearing. It involved, it was a really great effort from the Anglophone world primarily, but also from other, from the Spanish speaking, French speaking world. And Newman's influence is now really global. So part of that is because he writes in English, and a lot of these, young students, the second language that they're learning is English, so they can read this beautiful Victorian prose, which would have been, I think, very difficult before English was so widely used and understood. So it was interesting what Robert saying, Doctor of Modernity, and I really enjoy these things because I have a kind of settled thing that this is definitely, he's the Doctor of Development, and then Robert says this, and I go, oh no, he's the Doctor of Modernity. But I think development, they're complementary here, because I think development is kind of encased in modernity. And what I mean by that is that Newman was very aware. He's aware of the problem of historical consciousness. So I think in the 16th century, Catholics they're dealing with this great rupture in the heart of Christianity between the Reformation churches, the Protestant communities, and the Catholic Church, and they're not quite sure what to do about it. And there's an apologetic line, meaning a defense that Protestants change, but Catholics don't change. We've always believed exactly the same thing, and there is remarkable continuity, especially with practice, especially with some sacramental theology and many other areas. But there's an increasing realization that Catholicism has also changed, and changed tremendously. So the Essay on Development, which is the classic work on this question, published in 1845, is an occasional, I think Rod brought this up, that it is an occasional work where Newman is trying to solve a personal problem, which is he's an Anglican who idealizes the early church, and he really wants to bring the Anglican church back to the sacramental theology and the kind of ethos of the early church. And then this is really the fulcrum, the linchpin of his life. He then converts basically when he finishes this Essay on Development. And then he's very much calling the Catholic Church back to the early church. So there's an interesting, that what we would later call res source monta, but going back. And then there's also kind of going forward in his ideas of development, perhaps connected with what comes to be called aggiornamento. So Newman is dealing with this problem of historical consciousness. And I think one of his great insights really just hides in plain view. I think it's sort of obvious to us today, so we don't note how remarkable it is. And that is that the church is in history. I heard a lecture on this many years ago when I was a student by Thomas Fowle, who's a German scholar based at Duke. The church is in history. The church is not above history in a kind of triumphalist way. It's not somehow abstracted or apart from history, but it's in history. So he can make sense of change, and even remarkable change, and he does it in a kind of organic way. So there was a growing Catholic recognition in this period of a sort of syllogistic development. So if Mary is without original sin, therefore she's assumed into heaven, things like that. And Newman thinks, well, that's fine as far as it goes, but we have to be able to explain how an acorn becomes a tree, how the trickle becomes the roaring river, that sort of question. So he has principles. He talks about principles, and the principles come from divine revelation and are unchanging. So for example, the incarnation he speaks about as a principle, but then all kinds of doctrines can sort of flow out of this. So he's trying to explain something that might look really strange to an Anglican, like the veneration of relics that you might see when you travel throughout Italy in 1845, for example. And he's trying to explain that, and he explains how this is a doctrine which has developed and that might look very different from what 2nd, 3rd century Christians wrote about or did. But that this is an organic outgrowth of an unchanging principle. And this kind of thinking, I think, really equips Catholics later on in the 20th century when let me just say briefly, in the 19th century, the church is influenced by this. Some great recent work on Newman's impact, not only on 1870, on the First Vatican Council and the way that people understood development there, because there's things about the papacy in particular that were controversial, but also in 1854 with the Immaculate Conception. So Newman is in dialogue with these Roman college theologians who are coming from a more syllogistic perspective, but they're actually open to Newman. They think he's idiosyncratic and a little bit different, but they're actually open to him in ways that I think wasn't previously recognized. In the 20th century, Yves Congar, the great French Dominican, and Joseph Ratzinger, who becomes Pope Benedict XVI, they were both real fans of Newman. And my colleague Andrew Massaros, who's spent many years at Maynooth, now he's at the Angelicum, he has a great article showing that Dei Verbum, so the Vatican II Constitution on Revelation, has this beautiful passage, Dei Verbum, Article 8, on this growth and this development of doctrine. And Yves Congar is the principal author of that. And he's really has Newman in mind. He spent time in Cambridge. He was in trouble for some of his writing. He spends time in Cambridge. He reads a lot of Newman, and he really has Newman in mind. So Newman's fingerprints are all over the Second Vatican Council, also on the question of conscience. The Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Heenan, he quotes Newman on the council floor on the question of conscience. So I think Newman, really to me, and the beautiful thing about Newman is that, you have your pick: theology, philosophy, literature, pastoral life, preaching, all kinds of stuff. But to me, really, he's the doctor of development. And he's really helped equip us think in ways that are kind of nuanced and subtle, but also faithful about change and growth and development in the history of the church.
Thanks so much, Shaun. And it's great to hear those resonances in the Second Vatican Council documents as well. I think that that's something that I'm hoping we'll become more and more aware of now with this greater awareness of Newman. So we're shifting around. He might be the doctor of modernity, or he might be something else. Maybe we can play around with what he's doctor of. We could have our votes on that by the end of this session. I'm finding that that kind of intriguing as well. Rebekah, I wonder if I could ask you about this question of relativism, which I know you've thought about in your own work as well. So, what does Newman's critique of relativism in the church help us to understand? And how does he develop a richer sense of the church through this engagement that might help us today? So with that question of relativism, what does he help us to see?
Sure, thank you. So sometimes in Newman scholarship and in different discussions about relativism, sometimes it's conflated with or linked to a certain definition of liberalism that Newman was concerned about in his times. I think it's also important to note that each of these words have a genealogy. I can't get into all of it right now, but I would want to emphasize that Newman had a great respect for the liberal, which in its foundational term means that which is freeing. So he talks quite a bit about the importance of the liberal in education, even within the church. The church is that which helps us to further enter into the freedom of who we are and who we are called to be. The truth sets us free. And in Idea of the University, he talks a lot about how an education should be a liberal one. It should integrate all aspects of the human person, the spiritual, the intellectual, the social, and so forth. So I just want to say that liberalism or relativism or any ism can tend to be a thought system or an approach or a tendency that reduces things to a particular principle. And so what he was concerned about and discerning in the religious climate of his time within the Anglican Church, yes, but even to a degree in some strands of Catholicism. And this was certainly also in the air of the Victorian mindset more broadly, partly as an inheritance from certain romantic forms of thinking. But really this idea of religion becoming or faith becoming a kind of mode of private judgment and discernment only, with a real emphasis on the individual over and against others. Now, this is kind of in the air anyway. This is something of an inheritance and a development from certain strands of Enlightenment thinking. Thomas Fow, who's already been mentioned, has some great things to say about that in his massive book. I think you could use it for self-defense, called Minding the Modern. But he talks quite a bit about the way in which this burgeoning emphasis on private judgment, you do you, as it were, which was something quite popular now, cuts us off from certain fulsome understandings of how we arrive at truth, how we can discern truth, how we can even know ourselves. So Newman really wanted to emphasize that there are also communal and objective aspects of the truth that we can especially access, first of all, through divine revelation, which of course involves our assent to it. And he really emphasizes the play of grace here, the free gift of grace that God grants us to encounter him, to know him. And one of his concerns about the emphasis on private judgment over and against these other ways of knowing is kind of setting oneself up as the arbiter of what is moral, also the arbiter of how one's religion should go. And ultimately, again, I think it could be more nuanced, but one of his concerns, the deeper he went into history and the history of the church, the more he started to view the Anglican Church as what he calls a paper religion in Apologia Pro Vita Sua, that it is a construct, as it were, and in particular, he starts to see it as an imposition of certain individuals over against the larger collective history of the church. In saying that, there's a lot more we could unpack, but I think that becomes very important for him. And so his understanding of the way we arrive at truth is spelled out in many places, especially in Grammar of Assent. That's where he's really trying to approach it from different angles. And one of the things that really strikes me in that work, but also in some of his sermons, is the emphasis he places on trust, on relationships with other people, on learning from the tradition and the inheritance that's been granted to us, and that these are kind of mainstays, but also resources that help us to discern the fullness of truth. So he thinks individualism is ultimately kind of a myth, or maybe even a fantasy of emerging late modernity, because he would emphasize more, instead of being individualists, we are persons, we are made for community, we are made in the image and likeness of a triune God, and to discern the truth, we need both that searching for it, humble receptivity to the objective that we receive from outside, that we also have to test to ensure it is the truth. And that's maybe an adjacent question. How does he see us discerning the truth? And he thinks, amongst other things, the authority of the church, but also its wisdom, its witnesses of the saints, the examples of good lives lived, can also help us to test out and see what is right and what is good. So amongst other things, I'd say he views relativism as just too simplistic for the complexity of life, and also cutting us off from a richer view of life that we can only receive ultimately through the wisdom of the church, safeguarded by the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Rebekah. We have a question from the floor that's related to what you've just talked about. So I wonder if I might ask you and other members on the panel as well. So given Newman's position on liberalism in religion, is it possible to accommodate pluralism? And that might be something, Robert, with your engagement with Newman and Anglicanism, you might. I wonder if you might have something to say here as well.
I think Newman would have accepted the position of pluralism, because by the end of his life, he has reconciled himself to a reformed British constitution, which includes not simply Catholics, but Jews, other Protestant denominations, even though he himself wouldn't have believed in their accounts, certainly not their accounts of Catholicity. How he would have dealt with pluralism today, I suppose, is one of the challenging questions, because that in and of itself is a development. I suspect Newman would have taken into account the changes in the 20th century, those sort of great shifts that cause Catholics to think very differently on subjects, including, I should add, freedom of religion, which it really takes them a long time to deal with. And it's not until the 20th century that I think, and after the Second World War, that the Catholic Church is able to deal with that question in a way that probably has, brings the council back to, brings the council back to Newman's some of Newman's 19th century thought in receiving that. How he would have dealt with today is an open question. I think I suspect Newman would have moved beyond simplistic categories. I think he would have gone beyond the simple left-right positions that we often adopt, either ecclesiologically or politically. Dare I say he may even have put forward a via media, the middle way, a Catholic via media, which is an interesting concept given that that was developed as an Anglican. I think what he would have done is been sensible. I think he would have been pragmatic. I think he would have rejected excess on either side of left and right. I don't think that answer would have necessarily been a sort of a fuzzy sort of relativistic answer. That wouldn't have been Newman at all, and that isn't Newman. It would have been thoughtful. It would have been balanced.
Thank you, Robert. Shaun.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about. I really agree with Robert's nuanced take there. When Newman is impacting 19th century Catholic development on development, but the church isn't really self-consciously. I mean, the theologians know that the Immaculate Conception and the Declaration of Papal Infallibility are developments. They have to justify them. And they write a huge amount and they debate what is the best way to sort of express this doctrine. But it isn't really sort of public and self-conscious in the way it is in the 20th century. So Dignitatis Humanae, the document on religious liberty, in the first articles explicitly says we are developing doctrine. And I think that Newman I think that at Vatican II, when they are talking about development and debating development, they're kind of rolling three concepts together. The aggiornamento, which is associated with John the 23rd, the ressourcement, the going back to the sources. And then they also have this kind of organic Newmanian view of development as a kind of growth and understanding and a clarification of principles. So I think the challenge and the reason sometimes people get into, difficult debates, two lovers of Newman might sort of really disagree about something, is sort of when we talk about development or change in the church, like what exactly are we talking about? Because there's this sort of ressourcement implies a kind of going back and a possibly even a correction. So for example, Catholic teaching on the Jewish people at Vatican II, I mean, there is really a critique of the past, that there isn't really a critique with the Immaculate Conception. That's just a sort of beautiful flowering of kind of liturgy, piety, mysticism, and systematic theology. So like how does this all fit together is something that I don't think we completely have a hold on that yet, which is why I think this is a really great opportunity right now to have Newman named a doctor of the church.
And building on what you've both said there, and again, please, any of you feel free to answer this, but one of the questions that's come through, and I know, Robert, this is something that you raised when we were preparing for this webinar. One of the questions that has come through is even more specific than pluralism. Would the once Anglican John Henry Newman view the prospect of Anglo-Catholic ecumenism an elusive dream of Christian unity? Or let me go back to what we had talked about in advance, Robert, whether you think that Newman's Anglican thought might offer a model for a kind of constructive ecumenism. I know we're going out of order here, Rod, and I'll come back to you.
No,
go ahead.
There's a lot to unpack. I think, look, Newman is a convert who believes in conversion. He didn't literally fight for in the ideological sort of debates and periodicals and letters and he fought for what he believed to be Catholic truth. He does that in the 19th century. He clearly believes in the Catholic Church as a reality, as a truth, as the body of Christ. See, I think what happens with Newman, he's one of these conservatives in the 19th century. The Anglican state, the Anglican confessional state ends in the early 19th century in 1828, 1829. Newman, I think, is one of these conservatives who he believes in truth. Now, he believes in ecclesial truth. He thinks the church is the body of Christ, that it isn't a fuzzy entity. Now, having said that, he's clearly not a 19th century. He's not a simplist. He's not an ultramontane. He's not perhaps what we might call a 19th century traditionalist, but he believed in conversion. He believed it was. He certainly believed his conscience commanded him to leave the Church of England and become a Catholic. So I don't think Newman would have abandoned that. He would have maintained it. How that would translate into the present is itself a development of that other theologians will engage in. So it's on the one hand, we ask the question, how would Newman have acted in his historical context, and how does his thought translate now? There's obviously continuity and change there. But we have to keep the continuity and the change, I think, very closely together.
And I think that takes us back to, Rod, what you had been saying earlier. If I might turn to you and then over to Rebekah.
Well, what I would want to say in the light of some of these last conversations, and what Rob was saying, I think Newman remained committed to a via media, to a middle way. I mean, and I think he was picking up from what Robert said, he was opposed to extremism, and he was opposed to what he saw as Protestant error, and what as an Anglican he saw as Roman excess, things that he thought at that time that the Church of Rome had added to the deposit of faith. But when he became a Catholic, he continued to oppose the extremes. He opposed error. He believed there was truth and a falsehood. He opposed error where he saw it, and he also opposed excess, and he could find excess in Catholicism as well. Some of the more florid expressions of people like Frederick Faber. So that there was a way in which he maintained concern for that middle way. I think he also, when we're thinking about pluralism, he had a sense that any view that a person holds, there can be something that is good in it. Let's find out what that is. And in terms of what you were mentioning, Renée, about ecumenism and the possibilities there, picking up something that Rebekah said, I think that for Newman, because of his maintaining friendships after some painful years of separation, but nevertheless his restored friendships with some of his Anglican friends like Dean Church and Keble and Pusey. He never lost touch with Pusey. He's made it is a reminder to us of the importance, even when we can't see our way to agree on particular topics. Nevertheless, we maintain relationships of trust in search of the truth that we are seeking.
Thank you, Rod. Rebekah.
Just to briefly add a few other notes on to what has already been said, a couple of things, especially when we look at Apologia Pro Vita Sua, Newman emphasizes the profound degree to which, especially his Anglican years in Oxford, because of the deep friendships, the searching friendships, this band of friends who were searching for the truth together, he says it was instrumental in his ultimate conversion to Roman Catholicism. So he saw that his time as a truth-seeking Anglican was incredibly important to him. So I think he really, and as Rod has just said, really models in his friendships, in his pre and then post, and during his Catholic years, the ways in which friendships can be a very important model for developing ecumenical relationships and also advancing Christian unity. I do think it's quite clear he wants Christian unity. His first published text as an Oratorian priest is Discourses to Mixed Congregations, and the introduction, takes no prisoners. I mean, he tells these different Christian communities to whom he's addressing, to whom he's writing, and even preaching, he wants them to examine the Roman Catholic case and search their consciences to see if it's true. So I would be so bold to declare, and I'm curious if the others agree, that his ultimate hope is that all come to rest in the same fullness of truth that he does find in the Catholic Church, and he does hold to that. But he is a deep respecter of consciences, and there's even some interesting accounts of his friend and mentee Gerard Manley Hopkins, who is my favorite poet, who he is a convert to Catholicism, becomes a Jesuit, a bit younger than Newman, and Newman receives him into the church. But Hopkins really wrestled with converting to Catholicism, and Newman cautioned him to be careful, to be discerning, not to be rash, to speak with his family and friends, and to take his conversion quite seriously, and also not to do things in haste. And Newman was even quite discreet about some of his own steps that he took to become Catholic, because he didn't want to unduly influence or sway other people in their conscience. He really respected the conscience. So you have that, and you also have his full belief that Catholicism is the full expression of what God wants to tell us this side of heaven, really. So I think, the model of ecumenism for him is to move, I think, towards ultimate Christian unity, but in no way that is coercive. It is patient. It is hopeful. I was very struck by Rod's emphasis on the patience of Newman, and really, I think that reflects, even the patience of the Holy Spirit, who works over centuries with us. So anyway, that's what I want to offer.
The Holy Spirit doesn't have to put up with time in the same way that we do, though, I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah. Yeah.
So that might help somewhat. I'm conscious that we're running short of time here, which is, I think we could have spoken for much, much longer. But I wanted to ask you each just a final question, and I'm conscious that I haven't gotten to one of the questions in the box as well. But if I can just ask you this. So the saints can be a bit demanding, and doctors of the church can seem even more demanding, even kind of off there in the distance. Like there's this person who's unreachable. I could never come close to them, and certainly never know them, possibly on a personal level, when someone becomes a saint, and when someone becomes a doctor. And I hope that we have come to a closer appreciation of why this man is quite rightfully being declared a doctor of the church. But what I want to ask each of you is for your own view on whether, in fact, Newman should be more approachable or less approachable now for us as both a saint and a doctor. And as Robert, you put it quite wonderfully when we were talking in advance of this, how can we have a hagiography of someone who is both a saint and a doctor of the church moving forward? And if you want to squeeze in there what your claim would be for Newman is doctor of X before we close off, then I'd be very, very happy to take options as well. So, Shaun, I might start with you.
Yeah. Well, I would just say the very quick answer to Robert Gascoigne's question is yes, I absolutely think so. This idea of Newman's development and signs of the times and synodality, absolutely. Newman, so I think as far as the kind of approachability goes, Newman he's so open in his writing about he's very sensitive, he's very emotional. And I think that in an age where there's a real emphasis on interiority, a lot of people struggle with depression, with anxiety. I mean, he talks pretty, I'm not trying to diagnose him or anything, but I mean, he talks pretty openly about terrible feelings of desolation, of loneliness, of feeling that his name has been dragged through the mud, he's misunderstood. And it's not in a sort of wallowing, self-pitying way, but it's a real looking at his grief directly in the mirror and trying to deal with it through friendship and through prayer. And so I think he's actually enormously approachable. I mean, you don't want to hand someone Grammar of Assent or something like that if they don't, you don't start with that unless they love philosophy. But you know, his homilies and his letters, and I mean, there's so much beautiful stuff that is so accessible. So I'm excited for, you know, future teachers, myself included. And then I would close by saying I think Robert has convinced me. I think it's Doctor of Modernity because it's more holistic than development. It is
Thank you,
development,
Shaun.
but I think it's modernity. Yeah.
Okay, so one vote for Doctor of Modernity. Rod.
Well, I think that remarkable German-Polish Jesuit Eric Krisavara, whose name I probably mispronounced, so I apologize for that, but who said once long ago that Augustine was the father for the early church, Thomas Aquinas for the Middle Ages, and Newman for the modern world. And I think that what Newman really offers us is a methodology that can help us. It's not specific doctrines, but a way of looking at problems, a patience and a sensitivity to the complexity of issues, which perhaps does not go so well with our more polarized world, which likes things cut and dried. But I think it is what we need at this time. Doctor of Methodology sounds rather
Okay.
sounds rather dull, perhaps, but I suspect that's really what we're needing.
Thank you. And just briefly, Robert and Rebekah. Robert, I might come to you first.
I suppose methodology is quite close to modernity, so maybe we can have a synthesis of the two. I think Newman and approachability, I think we've reached the point, certainly with Newman, and I think with other saints, we need to have, I think, honest hagiographies. We have to have hagiographies that are historically real, that are historically contextual, that don't shy away from the controversial points in a saint's life. I think certainly I think we have moved into a time where we need to, I think, be open and honest about a saint's life, you know, in a way that's prudent and in a way that's respectful and reverent. I certainly don't shy away from those questions when I teach a course on Newman. I think Newman would have wanted us to ask, you know, the honest, open questions, even the controversial ones. So I certainly think Newman's approachable. He's approachable in a modern sense. And to be honest, I think he is a needed figure in some of the controversies that divide Catholics. I think he's probably helpful to mending bridges.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. And finally, Rebekah. And then I promise, Amanda, I'll hand back to you.
Just briefly, I'll say it's been wonderful to hear what everyone else has contributed. I would also agree. I do think of him as the doctor of modernity or emerging late modernity. And his capacity to be a friend, I think, first of all, is rooted deeply in his relationship with God. And I think that he is a wonderful example to us of how the life of prayer and the relationship with God can then shape and transform our daily life. I think he's also a saint of the ordinary. You know, a lot of his letters are, you know, about like asking his mother tips on how do you like make sure that the school children he's taking care of, you know, are clean and like have food and things like that. And then, you know, he's also concerned about these weighty political matters. So he really paid attention to the duty of the moment. And so I think he's really a saint of the ordinary. If you look at his letters, a lot of his concerns are really about, you know, who is under his care and who he should be paying attention to.
Thank you so much, Rebekah. It's a beautiful way to end on the note of friendship, and that great friendship that we're all called to with God. Thank you, and back to you, Amanda.
Oh, thank you so much. It was an illuminating webinar, and it was really good of you all to give of your time, especially Shaun when it's 4 o'clock. Well, it'll be 5 o'clock there now in the morning. So I hope you do get your nap later on, as we discussed before the webinar. Coming up for tablet webinars, we've got Faith in the Elderly, Holding Fast in a Changing Church, Wednesday the 10th of September. And then we've got a few live events. So we've got Unveiled, Why Are So Few Women Becoming Nuns Today? That's Thursday the 2nd of October at the Cardinal Vaughan Memorial School. And we have Austin Ivory and Ed Sturton talking about From Francis to Leo, Reshaping the Church for a Change of Era. That's sponsored by CCLA Investment Management Services. Once again, thank you so much to our panel. It's been an absolute delight working with you on this webinar. Thank you to our sponsors, University of Notre Dame, Australia, and thank you to you for joining us. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing for the rest of your day, I hope you enjoy it. On behalf of myself and the rest of the Tablet team, we'd just like to wish you a very good rest of your day. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.